There have been whispers since the early 1960s that the U.S. government and military have been involved with discovering caverns hidden under the desert of the Southwest. They've also been active in creating underground cities and bases. One of the more dramatic scenarios involves an underground base near the town of Dulce, New Mexico. The first base came into prominence when UFO researcher Paul Benowitz accidentally discovered it. But who was Paul Benowitz?
So Paul Benowitz was a U.S. private scientist who had a small defense company of his own, and he did contract work for the U.S. military in the 1970s. Paul Benowitz lived right across from Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, and in the mid to late 1970s started to detect, he had very sophisticated instrumentation at his home, detect what he believed were UFOs over Kirtland and Manzano as well, the weapons storage area nearby there, detect different types of communications signals that he believed he had translated. In fact, I have translations of those. And so he became convinced that there was serious UFO and basically extraterrestrial activity over Kirtland and Manzano, the weapons storage facility where there was a ton of nukes.
And Benowitz had an interest in UFOs, and this was expanded upon by the fact that he started to see in the skies over Kirtland these strange objects performing all sorts of weird maneuvers. At the same time, the equipment at the Thunder Company was picking up these unusual, unexplained noises, which seemed to be some sort of coded message. And Benowitz came to believe that what he was seeing in the sky were definitive UFOs, extraterrestrial spacecraft, and that these coded messages he was picking up were covert messages from extraterrestrial craft to other extraterrestrial craft. And he began to dig into this issue very, very deeply.
Paul Benowitz lived in Albuquerque, next to Kirtland Air Force Base, which was and is a center of a lot of secret weapons and weapons systems and aircraft research. And so he was uniquely positioned to see what was going on the base because he lived on a hill, his house is still there, overlooking the entire base. And he could see things, especially late at night when they were doing testing. And they didn't figure anybody was up at that hour, but Paul Benowitz was. He had a degree, I think a master's in electrical engineering.
And so he began intercepting radio communications, firstly involving a Manzano nuclear facility there in New Mexico. And so he was able to get some of this information about UFOs, monitoring this facility, spying on that. And he was getting some really interesting communications that he felt were extraterrestrial in origin. And he learned a lot of things about the extraterrestrials or whoever it was in the UFOs that were piloting them, communicating amongst themselves and communicating with actors on the ground.
So he foolishly and naively alerted the U.S. government to this fact. In fact, he wrote letters to President Ronald Reagan after 1981, several, I think, alerted the people at Kirtland.
Well, he started seeing and then filming with a 8mm camera, I believe, these objects lighting up, raising up in the air, going off behind a mountain and dropping down behind the mountain. And he said he thought that these were some sort of UFOs with aliens piloting them. And he wanted the Air Force to know this, as if somehow they wouldn't know that this was going on their own base. He also said he saw people walking around them with flashlights before they took off, which is another weird thing.
He essentially opened his entire books up to them and said, I've been seeing these objects, I've been filming them, there are these coded transmissions coming from them, and I've recorded them, and I'm starting to decipher them. So for people working at the base who are enlisted to take part in these controversial classified programs, Benowitz was immediately perceived as a potential threat to national security, because he was digging into something that was highly controversial but also deeply secret as well. So he'd really tipped the scales against himself. And that's when the people at the base began saying to him, well, what is it that you've found? Maybe we can help you a little bit. But this was really done to try and convince him to open up and tell them everything he knew. That would then allow them to see how much damage had been done and how much damage control they then had to put into place. So looking back at it, we could say he was almost his own worst enemy by revealing what it was that he'd found.
So this was something, him being a loyal American citizen, he went to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and he began working with one of their intelligence officials, Richard Doty. And Doty was basically having Benowitz debriefed, and actually they came up with some funding for Benowitz to continue to do this research because they were interested in finding out what it was Benowitz had learned.
Benowitz was fully aware that he was being watched, but he took it as almost like a double-edged sword, that he knew that he was being watched and he wasn't too happy about that. But on the other hand, he realised that if he was being watched, then clearly he was on the right path. So he tried to juggle things where he knew some of these people were somewhat hostile to him, but others were actually trying to help him by giving him information. So it was a case of having to work with one and having to put up with the other.
So Air Force Office of Special Investigations was trying to work out what's going on, but eventually they were ordered to basically take Benowitz out, and the way they did it was to work with the Greys, because they did have agreements with the Grey extraterrestrials, and Grey extraterrestrials began messing with Benowitz, and eventually he had a nervous breakdown, and that's when his involvement in this whole field came to an end.
Paul Benowitz was led to believe that there was a secret underground base located near Dulce, New Mexico. He began flying there in his plane to check out the area.
Eventually what happened was they began to mess with him, and some extraterrestrials, a group of grey extraterrestrials that were working with the military in the Dulce base. Benowitz's radio equipment had been able to intercept the communications between the extraterrestrials and the human operators in the base, in the underground base. So Dulce becomes a point of focus for Benowitz, and he trains his equipment there, and he has some high-speed photographic equipment there as well, and he's actually able to photograph some of the ships, some of the UFOs going into the mesa, where you actually have a kind of vibrational shift in some of the craft.
And the more he dug into it, he found himself exposed to even more nightmarish stories, many of them coming from Dulce. For example, a lot of these insiders, whistleblowers if you like, claimed to him that all sorts of unspeakable experiments were being undertaken in the Dulce base. People were being used as guinea pigs, if you like, in bizarre genetic experiments, splicing alien and human DNA together and creating strange half-human, half-alien creatures. And reportedly there were hundreds and hundreds of people kept in the Dulce base in cages, you know, the people who go missing every year, that kind of thing.
So Benowitz did strongly believe that there was an underground base at Dulce, New Mexico. I don't think he was necessarily far off, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't necessarily discredit what Benowitz thinks. I think it's entirely possible that there was and may even still be some underground activity near Dulce. First of all, just generally speaking, it is documented and known that no later than the 1960s did the United States Navy have detailed plans to build deep underground facilities, deep underground military bases, DUMBs, in various parts of the United States and globally. And that not just under the ground, but under the ocean floor. We have illustrations, drawings of this at the time by illustrators who were hired by the Navy to do this. Now, whether they did it or not is another question, but certainly they were thinking about this. And by the way, the expense, the money, the technology, all of that was totally doable in the context of 1960s. So it could be done. All you need to do for an underground ocean base is extract oxygen out of the water. And we know how to do that. We've done that since the 50s. Have a source of energy down there and you can play ping pong and under nice fluorescent lighting for days and weeks and months. No problem. Underground bases are not difficult. Underground bases under the mountains, ditto.
In northern New Mexico, animals were being found drained of blood with organs removed. Black helicopters were seen flying around the area, strange lights, UFOs, and it all revolved around this huge mesa which overlooks Dulce, called the Archuleta Mesa. One of the intriguing theories is that there exists within and below this huge mesa some sort of fortified alien installation, an extraterrestrial base if you like. And certainly since the 1970s right through to the present day, a lot of research has been done into the Dulce area to try and answer that question. Are extraterrestrials living under New Mexico in the Dulce area?
Yeah, back in the 1950s in Farmington, there was an armada of UFOs seen going from Farmington eastward towards Dulce. Terrified everybody, made the newspapers, and then nothing.
In today's world, a lot of nations do have underground installations, and it makes a great deal of sense because if, God forbid, there was ever a nuclear war, then if some sort of containment of government is going to take place and continuation, then the best place to be in a Third World War is underground. It makes sense. So a lot of these installations were built during the height of the Cold War to protect the government, while unfortunately the rest of us are left upstairs to fry. And one of the theories is that some of these installations may have been built for potentials in the event of a Third World War, but over time they may have been reorganized and transformed to where you have these alien-human interactions going on. In other words, very much like Dulce.
We had people coming forward, finally sharing UFO sightings, engagements with cryptids, creatures they could not explain. For the first time on record, multiple families, independent of one another, said they hear traffic beneath their town. Traffic like cars and trucks. They hear like what sounds like a train system. And we all know about the maglev tunnel system that supposedly exists there. There is one that exists within the Los Alamos infrastructure. It's an underground maglev system.
What's interesting about Dulce itself is that back in 1967 there was a program called Operation Gas Buggy, and ostensibly it was to detonate atomic bombs underground in the Dulce area to try and extract natural gas. Now, some researchers believe that that was a cover story and the nuclear blasting was actually done to expand the Dulce base, or even to try and wipe out the hostile aliens that were down there. In other words, we have this situation where, according to Phil Schneider, the Dulce base was almost like a nightmarish Frankenstein's type lab.
The small town of Dulce always experienced a lot of high strangeness. However, in the mid-1990s, a man came forth with a stunning story about his experiences in an underground base built under the Archuleta Mesa, just north of Dulce. His name was Phil Schneider.
Phil Schneider, he started going public in the mid-1990s, and he started attending some UFO conferences and started to reveal his background as a civil engineer. He showed his documentation that he was the son of an Operation Paperclip scientist, and that he was recruited into these covert programs. It tends to be a kind of generational thing, so he just followed his father's footsteps, building these underground bases that would be joint facilities for extraterrestrials and elite human units. So he's building these bases all over the place. He's part of the team that kind of like is looking at different areas that would be suitable for the construction of a base. And he described a number of incidents. One of the incidents happened in 1979, the famous Dulce battle, where he says that they sunk a shaft. They were basically doing some mining exploration there to see where they could build a facility in that arena, and they basically came into an area that was a very old cavern system where grey extraterrestrials had a base. And the story was that what happened was that there were elite military units that went down there, Delta Forces and other special forces, SEALs and so forth, went down there, and they basically encountered these tall grey extraterrestrials. And so there was a firefight down there, and approximately 60 military personnel and scientists were killed, and Schneider gets wounded, but he's alive and he gets extracted out of there. So that's the famous Dulce battle, which was basically where the US military went into an area where they weren't supposed to be.
His version of events is that there was an altercation there. He was involved in the altercation. He was hit with some sort of a plasma weapon which seared off a portion of his hand, and that he had managed to escape with samples, synthetic samples that were synthesized by the Greys that essentially led to the development of our stealth technology. He was displaying these at conferences as part of these preparedness expos. He had this whole connection to aliens, essentially, and for him the catalyst was his time at Dulce. And it was this 1979 engagement with the Greys. And that's pretty much the crux of his story. And as you know, he went on the lecture circuit and died as a result.
Phil Schneider was an interesting character who's now deceased. His father was a man named Oscar Schneider, who had a lot of responsibility during the Second World War. He was involved in early atomic bomb tests, worked on nuclear submarines, and according to Phil Schneider, his father also worked on the infamous Philadelphia experiment in 1943, which was allegedly a program to try and make a warship invisible to the enemy. But as far as Phil Schneider's concerned, he came forward many years ago now, talking about how he said he was an engineer and was working on a lot of programs to construct massive underground installations all across the United States.
And so Schneider began in the mid-1990s talking about the Dulce battle, talking about his involvement in building these underground bases. He said that there were just over 100 of them all over the United States, that there were some in other places of the world like Pine Gap in Australia. He disclosed the size of the budget, of the black budget, and his estimate was pretty accurate. He said back in that day, he said it was around $1 trillion. So he's talking about the early 1990s, and it was funding all of these bases. And he broke ranks when he realized that what was being created was a new world government. That he saw a facility that was being created that would host the United Nations. And he said that what greatly disturbed him was that where the United Nations diplomats would be meeting and conducting their business for the planet, that above them was a kind of alcove where the grey extraterrestrials would be observing. And he realised that the New World Order was basically going to be controlled by these grey extraterrestrials who were working with the German groups out of Antarctica. And so this was something that he decided that he couldn't go along with this. He would reveal the truth, and that's what he was doing right up until early 1996. He turns up dead in his apartment, strangled. An autopsy isn't really conducted, and people start disclosing that this is exactly what he had been warning against, that he would be assassinated for revealing all this information. And it was made to look like a suicide, but the people who knew him and know about the circumstances, the lack of a rigorous autopsy, that Schneider had been murdered for revealing too much.
The fact of the matter is that he was killed because of what he was doing. And it's very clear to researchers who've looked into it. There is an effort underway right now to suppress that information. There are books that are coming out that are filled with alternative realities of what actually occurred, and all of them are part of this narrative that he was a liar, there's nothing in Dulce, everybody just please go away and forget about all of this nonsense of grey aliens.
One of the primary things that Phil Schneider talked about at Dulce was this particular issue of human beings used against their will in strange and controversial genetic experimentation. The other angle that Phil Schneider was also well known for was pointing out that we, the human race, the military, the government, had lost control of the Dulce base. Yes, we worked there, but most of the people who were in there were very fearful of their lives, and Schneider believed that essentially the base had become not so much a no-go area for us, but a highly dangerous place where the aliens were calling the shots. What it boils down to is that the Dulce base is totally under alien control, where you had the base itself constructed possibly by the military and people like Schneider and the people he was working with, but then when the alien component comes along, things kind of change. They start to take control, the military retreats. But according to Schneider, a lot of the experiments that were going on under Dulce in this particular base were sort of horrendous. People in jails, if you like, in chains, held prisoner and used by these extraterrestrial entities how and whenever they wanted to. This involved bizarre genetic experiments, gene splicing, crossbreeding humans and aliens, and for want of a better term, everything being done for the benefit of the aliens and none of it being done for the benefit of us. There's no doubt that when it comes to the Dulce story, that had it not been for Phil Schneider, Dulce certainly would not be talked about in the way that it is today.
Phil Schneider was one of the first people to blow the whistle on the secret base under Dulce, New Mexico. But has anyone else talked? Has anyone else become a whistleblower?
Gabe Valdez was a New Mexico state police officer, and he had, I would say, a very involved connection with the people of the Dulce Hickory Apache Reservation. And he was friends with lots of them. And the Hickory have their own police department. And I know some of the veteran police officers from the Hickory Apache Reservation, and Gabe was instrumental in helping to establish that the cattle mutilations, the UFO sightings, everything that was occurring there in Dulce led to something even stranger. He produced photographs of a hybrid. This is a calf with a human head. And that made its way into the public by way of Bill Burns, his television show. And then after it aired on UFO Hunters, Congress immediately enacted this law that stated no human-animal hybridization, and then the show was canceled. I had a source, an insider, introduce me to this retired United States Air Force colonel. That's how I got involved with the whole Dulce story. And he had to get this off his chest. This is something that, before he went into permanent hiding, he had to share with somebody. So I got the break of the century. And he says he was part of this classified medical detachment out of McClellan Air Force Base. And what they did was they studied these events that were top secret military projects that whenever something went wrong, it was his team's job to immediately go wherever this was happening, provide assessments, and make determinations. So he says in '79, he got a call to report to, and not with his team, with a impromptu put together squad, and they were all supposed to meet up at Edwards Air Force Base. Once there, they would get briefing documentations that they were supposed to read, briefing documents, on their way to this undisclosed facility, Dulce, New Mexico. When he was reading the briefing documents, he thought he was reading about Native Americans who lived in the caverns at this facility. And it didn't make sense to him why Native Americans would be living inside of an underground complex, a complex series of caverns and whatnot. It wasn't until they were about to reach New Mexico that he realized, oh, these aren't humans. I'm reading about something non-human. And he was chosen specifically with these other individuals because whoever it was that assembled the team knew that this team would not crack under the pressure. When they got to Dulce, they knew that they would just conduct business as usual. And they did. For him, it turned into something fruitful. He ended up working there for the next several years. And through working there, he learned so much about the advancement, this exponential advancement in our levels of technology. It all comes from Dulce. Everything comes from Dulce. There's a group in Los Alamos called the Technological Commercialization Office that takes technologies and puts them out into the private sector. And we made a big discovery. We discovered a company called Hyperion, who was led by Lady Barbara Judge, who was knighted by the Queen of England, giving her commander of the British Empire this very prestigious knighting for two reasons: her work in the nuclear sector and the international banking sector. Now here's where it gets strange. Hyperion, nobody knew about them. My source said, you need to look into this company in Los Alamos. Why? Because there's your proof of reverse engineered alien technology or emerging alien technology, because most people don't realize there's two types. We go to crash retrievals and we find downed ET craft and we reverse engineer it. You go to Dulce, where these gray beings, these Igigis, these creations of the Anunnaki, have been living for 25,000 years, and they provide us, they gift us in exchange with technology for resources. Now, back to Hyperion. Strange company. I looked up their information, and I was able to find their documentation. And they only sold one thing: micronuclear reactors. And they only sold it to a select few: offshore drilling and mining operations and foreign militaries. Now, here's where it gets strange. The colonel told me that the Dulce facility is actually powered by micronuclear reactors, and he went into specific detail as to how they are. It was like a year and a half later when Hyperion information finally emerged, and they have 4 office locations. They're in Los Alamos, they are in Langley, Virginia, they're adjacent to Denver International Airport, and London, the financial capital of the world. Denver being because they, of course, if this is the business that they're in, they need to be by the largest continuity of government facility, which is beneath the airport. Signs are everywhere. Television shows have been kicked out of the airport. Everybody knows what's happening there. So we dug deep, we outed them. They changed the name of their company. They removed all documentation with regards to the product that they sell. One thing, micronuclear reactors. And they're now called 4Gen Technologies, and you pretty much don't know what they do, but they're still a public company.
The stories surrounding the area around Dulce, New Mexico are growing and getting stranger by the day. Strange creatures, aliens, UFOs, and more have been seen by eyewitnesses.
But Dulce is much more than gray aliens and the engagement with these gray aliens by the people. It has a deep, rich history which traces all the way back to the Anunnaki, who placed them there 25,000 years ago to die off. They infected them with some sort of a virus. They were not meant to survive. John Lear calls them cybernetic organisms, and he is partly right, because in order to sustain their continued evolution, to maintain being alive, they have had to adapt. They have had to adapt by becoming a hybrid of technology and their biological makeup to continue on. And that's why I think it's another reason why you're seeing a lot of advancements in robotics with like Boston Dynamics, artificial intelligence.
The local Native American tribes who live at the Yacarillo Reservation near Dulce have known about the presence of these alien groups for a long time.
They've had so many interactions, but it is not within their culture to talk about this openly. They don't try to conceal anything, but in order for you to get information from them, you have to ask them, and nobody talks to them. So this chief of police that we interviewed with the ASPE organization and MUFON both being present, he gave us in detail description of what he could only describe as escaped projects, experiments from unknown projects at the Dulce facility. Over a span of 20 years, he had encountered some, on average 1 a year, some hybrid or cryptid type being between Dulce and Taos. The wilderness is huge up there. And some were reports that as a police officer, he was told to go investigate. Others, just happenstance. It just, out of nowhere. Winged creatures, hybrid human greys lost in the woods. People talking with Bigfoot-type creatures, having intelligent conversations, strange things. And he believes in his heart that this all came about from Dulce, what they're conducting there. We know that one of the major mandates of the Dulce facility was these super soldier experiments, hybrid experiments, hybridization experiments. So it's not surprising to me that him being an official who's seeking public office or going to seek public office, he needed to get this off of his chest, this monkey off of his back. However, he still couldn't come out public with it, but he wanted the public to know this is crazy. This is not what you would expect from a current chief of police of a major community in the area.
The most common thing that's reported that's unusual there are small 2-foot hairy dwarves. They're seen constantly, even in town on Main Street. I've been chasing this footage that somebody has there, and I'm trying to track it down. The old casino site had a surveillance camera set up, inside and out. And one night, these dwarves started jumping from car to car, putting dents in people's hoods in the parking lot, and they caught them on camera. Now, according to Hoyt Velarde, who was for many years, 35 years, was the head of the Department of Public Safety there, the chief law enforcement officer, he confirmed the story to me. I had another current officer also confirm the story. The Bigfoot there's extra large Bigfoot there, the largest outside of the Pacific Northwest, the largest hairy hominids that I've heard of. They go 12 feet around Dulce. Hoyt Velarde's had one right on his property. He got within 100 feet of one in broad daylight, and he was able to step over a 4-strand barbed wire fence without even slowing down.
There are a number of theories for what's going on at Dulce. You have the idea that it could be some sort of very, very old alien base that essentially was constructed by extraterrestrials who knows how long ago. Another intriguing and also controversial theory is the idea that elements of the US military or the government are working in tandem with extraterrestrials within this base. And an even more controversial theory suggests that these extraterrestrials may be quite dangerous to us and we actually got kicked out. And for the most part, it's perceived as sort of a no-go area for the government now. Or it could be a combination of all these different scenarios and theories. But what we do know for sure is that there has been an extraordinary amount of UFO activity, sightings, abductions, cattle mutilations, all throughout this particular area.
Whatever is happening at Dulce, New Mexico will probably remain a mystery for the near future. The isolation and lack of population make the American Southwest a perfect place to hide something.